After dates come and go, after predictions rise and fall, one thing remains constant. God never leaves his people without direction, protection, and purpose. So when we talk about what will happen to Christians after 21 November, we're not talking about fear, panic, or speculation. We're talking about identity, authority, and the divine assignments God gives his children in every season. This is a moment where believers must wake up, rise up, and step into the role God has prepared for them long before this date ever existed. When we talk about what God does with his people after a moment of spiritual transition, after a date that seems to mark a shift in the atmosphere, we need to understand something fundamental. God is a master of separation. Not separation as the world defines it, division, conflict, detachment, but separation as heaven defines it, alignment. God knows how to remove the noise so you can hear the signal. He knows how to clear the fog so you can finally see the direction. And sometimes the very thing we call loss is actually the preparation for a larger assignment. You'll notice that after seasons like this, after a date, a shift, or a moment where people begin to feel something stirring, God starts rearranging the relationships and environments around his children. Not because he wants to isolate them, but because he wants to refine them. There are certain places you can only go when you stop carrying the weight of people who were never meant to take that journey with you. And we all have people like that. People who were good for where we were, but not good for where God is taking us next. But here's the part we rarely acknowledge. Sometimes the distraction is not a person. Sometimes the distraction is a habit, a mindset, a belief system, or even a version of ourselves that God is gently asking us to outgrow. There are Christians who keep praying for elevation while holding on to the very thing that keeps them grounded in fear, insecurity, or comfort. God won't move you into your destiny while you're still tied to your distraction. So after this moment, after this shifting, the believer becomes aware of what God has been trying to remove all along. It is often in these seasons that God exposes the attachments that are quietly draining our purpose, the friendships that pull us backward instead of forward, the environments that make us shrink instead of rise, the patterns that create stagnation instead of growth. And the beautiful thing is that God doesn't expose these things to punish us. He exposes them to prepare us. You can't walk in spiritual maturity while living in emotional clutter. And God loves us too much to let us stay in places that limit his work within us. And you know, sometimes the hardest thing for a believer is accepting that separation is a blessing. Because in our culture, everything is about addition. More followers, more connections, more voices, more noise. But in the kingdom, growth often begins with subtraction. God will take away before he multiplies. He'll prune before he prospers. He'll isolate before he elevates. And if you misunderstand that divine strategy, you will confuse protection with rejection. When God removes someone or something from your life, it's not always because it was bad. Sometimes it's simply because it was not aligned with where he's taking you next. Elevation requires alignment, and alignment requires letting go. If God allowed every voice, every opinion, every distraction to stay in your life, you would never develop the spiritual sensitivity to hear him clearly. He reduces the volume around you so he can increase the revelation within you. That's why after a moment like this, after a spiritual turning point, some Christians will suddenly feel the desire to detach from old environments, old habits, old conversations, and old influences. That's not random. That's not coincidence. That is the Holy Spirit preparing you for a higher assignment. That is God saying, I'm separating your destiny from your distraction so you can walk in the fullness of who I made you to be. So if you find yourself in a season where God is shutting doors, changing circles, or disturbing your comfort, don't resist it. Don't fight it. Don't panic. Recognize it. Lean into it. Because he is not taking anything away from you. He is taking you towards something greater. And here's the thought I want you to carry with you. Sometimes God must separate you so he can elevate you. Let him finish what he started. When God begins to separate distraction from destiny, something else happens almost immediately afterward. Your spiritual senses start waking up. It's like when a room finally gets quiet and suddenly you can hear the ticking of a clock you didn't even know was there. The noise wasn't the problem, it was the obstruction. In the same way, when God clears away the clutter, believers begin to notice a sensitivity within their spirit that they couldn't access before. It's not mystical, it's alignment. Your soul becomes tuned to the right frequency. You see, most Christians think spiritual sensitivity is some rare prophetic gift reserved for a special class of believers. But in reality, spiritual sensitivity is simply the natural result of an uncluttered heart. When your mind stops wrestling with distractions and your spirit stops drowning in noise, you're able to perceive things you used to ignore. You begin feeling the nudge of the Holy Spirit when you're about to stray. You hear the internal warning when someone's intentions don't match their words. You sense the difference between what is urgent and what is important. That's not spooky, it's maturity. This sensitivity also helps believers distinguish between truth and deception. And this is crucial today, because we live in a world where information overload creates confusion instead of clarity. Everybody has an opinion. Everybody has a platform. Everybody has a message. But not everything that sounds spiritual is spirit-led. Not everything that looks motivational is God-inspired. And not everything that feels right is aligned with truth. When God sharpens your spiritual senses, you begin to notice the difference. You recognize when your emotions are being manipulated. You detect when a message is driven by fear rather than faith. You become aware of the subtle ways the culture tries to reshape your identity, your morals, and your convictions. And this isn't just about discernment regarding the world around you. It's also about discernment regarding yourself. Spiritual sensitivity forces you to confront your internal motives. You start noticing when you're praying for something that's rooted in insecurity rather than purpose. You can tell when your desires are influenced by comparison instead of calling. You sense when your ego tries to dress itself in spiritual language. That level of awareness may be uncomfortable, but it is transformative. Because once you see your own heart clearly, the enemy loses the ability to deceive you from within. Another thing happens when spiritual sensitivity increases. Your appetite changes. What satisfied you before no longer fills you. You can't enjoy the conversations you used to enjoy. You can't entertain the distractions that once consumed your time. You can't sit comfortably in places that drain your spirit. Your soul starts craving something deeper. Truth, purpose, intimacy with God, clarity about your calling. You begin valuing peace over popularity, authenticity over acceptance, wisdom over noise. And that shift is not emotional, it's spiritual. It's important to understand that this sensitivity does not make life easier. It makes life clearer. You still face storms, but now you recognize the difference between a storm sent to destroy you and a storm sent to develop you. You still encounter people who challenge your peace, but now you sense their intentions before they disrupt your path. You still walk through seasons of uncertainty, but now you hear God's guidance in places you once felt alone. Spiritual sensitivity doesn't remove life's battles. It equips you to fight them correctly. And as this sensitivity grows, Christians become less reactive and more responsive. Instead of panicking, they pause. Instead of rushing, they discern. Instead of being pulled in every direction, they anchor themselves in what God is saying, not what the world is screaming. That is the power of spiritual awareness. It gives you the ability to move with purpose instead of pressure. So if you've been feeling a shift inside you, if certain things don't feel the same, if your spirit seems more alert, if you've been sensing things you can't quite explain, don't dismiss it. God is tuning your heart so you can hear Him clearly in the days ahead. Let that sensitivity guide your steps. And here's the thought I want to leave with you. When your spirit becomes sensitive, your life becomes guided. Don't ignore the whisper. Your next breakthrough is hidden in it. When spiritual sensitivity begins to rise, something else naturally follows. God starts exposing motives, both around us and within us. And this is where many believers get uncomfortable, because exposure does not feel like a blessing at first. It feels like disruption. But what we call disruption, God calls correction. What we call embarrassment, God calls enlightenment. He reveals not to shame us, but to shape us into people who can carry responsibility without collapsing under the weight of hidden flaws. You see, one of the biggest obstacles to spiritual growth is the illusion we build around ourselves. We craft versions of who we want to be seen as: strong, stable, spiritual, wise, while quietly hiding the insecurities, fears, and contradictions we don't want anyone to notice. But God cannot transform the version of you that you pretend to be. He can only transform the version of you that you're willing to expose. And so, after moments of spiritual awakening, He often begins shining light on the areas we've kept tucked away. Sometimes that exposure happens through conviction. Your conscience becomes sharper. You feel uncomfortable entertaining the things you used to justify. You notice impatience rising where you thought you had peace. You realize jealousy where you believed you had joy. It's not that these issues suddenly appear, they were always there. But sensitivity makes them visible. God isn't revealing your flaws to condemn you. He's showing you where He wants to heal you. Other times, exposure comes through relationships. God will use people to reflect what you cannot see in yourself. Maybe someone calls out a pattern you've been ignoring. Maybe a conflict reveals pride you didn't know you carried. Maybe a disappointment exposes attachment to something you never surrendered. The moment feels frustrating, but its purpose is liberation. You cannot be free from what you refuse to face. And then there are moments when God exposes the motives of others, not to make you suspicious, but to make you wise. You start noticing the difference between someone who wants connection and someone who wants access, between someone who values you and someone who uses you, between someone who speaks truth and someone who speaks convenience. Discernment becomes sharper because God is protecting the assignment He placed inside you. You can't afford to be surrounded by people whose intentions conflict with your destiny. But let's go deeper here, because the most transformative exposure happens internally. God begins revealing why you do what you do. You discover that some of your good actions come from unhealthy places, like serving others to feel needed, performing spiritually to feel valuable, or helping people to avoid dealing with your own pain. This kind of revelation is uncomfortable, but it is also liberating. Because once you understand your motive, you can correct your direction. You can shift from living in reaction to living in purpose. Exposure is not only about correction, it's about preparation. God cannot elevate what He has not purified. He cannot entrust influence to someone who is controlled by hidden wounds or unexamined motives. So when God shines light on the parts of you that you've been avoiding, it means He's getting you ready for something that requires integrity, clarity, and maturity. He's clearing out the internal clutter so the external blessing doesn't become a burden. This process also teaches humility. When God exposes your motives, it softens the judgment you once had toward others. You stop assuming you know their story. You stop rushing to conclusions. You become more compassionate, more patient, more gracious, because you realize how much grace God has extended to you. Exposure makes you more human, more honest, and more aligned with God's heart. And remember this, God doesn't expose everything at once. He reveals layer by layer, because healing happens in stages. Growth happens in seasons. Transformation is not an event, it's a process. And God walks with you through every part of it, not as a critic, but as a father shaping his child into someone capable of carrying real spiritual weight. So if God is showing you something uncomfortable, don't run from it. Don't explain it away. Don't hide it behind excuses. Face it with courage, because exposure is not the end of you. It is the beginning of your becoming. Here's the truth I want you to hold on to. What God exposes, He intends to heal. Let Him bring the truth to light so He can bring your destiny to life. When God begins exposing motives and purifying the inner life of His people, something profound follows. He releases a level of protection that is not always visible to the natural eye, but undeniable in its effects. It's the kind of covering that doesn't announce itself, but you feel it, you sense it, and eventually you recognize that without it, certain things would have destroyed you long ago. This is where many Christians misunderstand the nature of divine protection. They imagine it only in terms of avoiding harm. No accidents, no sickness, no trouble, no storms. But God's protection is deeper than that. Sometimes His protection is not the absence of danger, but the presence of peace right in the middle of it. There are moments in life when you don't get to avoid the fire, but the fire doesn't burn you. Moments when you don't get to escape the storm, but the storm cannot swallow you. Moments when the weapon forms, but it mysteriously loses its ability to prosper. That's protection. That's divine interference. That's the invisible hand of God operating behind the scenes, blocking what you didn't even know was coming. And you begin noticing this kind of protection more intensely after seasons of spiritual awakening. Not because God suddenly becomes protective, but because you finally become aware of how protected you already were. Spiritual sensitivity sharpens your perception. It makes you recognize the danger you walked past, the temptations you resisted, the relationships God closed before they collapsed on you, the decisions He redirected before they derailed your destiny. You begin to look back and say, if God hadn't stepped in right there, that moment would have broken me. You see, divine protection is not just about physical safety. It's about emotional, mental, and spiritual preservation. There are attacks that target your peace of mind. There are experiences designed to crush your confidence. There are people who carry words that could wound your self-worth for years. There are environments that can suffocate your calling without ever laying a hand on your body. God protects you from all of that. Sometimes He protects you by closing doors you desperately wanted opened. Other times He protects you by removing people you begged Him to let stay. And yes, sometimes He protects you by allowing hardship to reveal what would have destroyed you if it had stayed hidden. What most believers don't realize is that divine protection often comes disguised as disappointment. You think something went wrong, when in reality something went right. A plan fell apart because God refused to let you step into a future that would have sabotaged you. A friendship deteriorated because the connection was draining your spiritual identity. An opportunity collapsed because it was built on foundations too weak to sustain your assignment. And it's only after your spiritual eyes open that you begin to understand. God didn't block your blessing, He blocked your breakdown. As this awareness grows, Christians begin to walk with a confidence that is not arrogant but anchored. They stop fearing every negative headline, every spiritual attack, every shift in the world around them. They stop living in a posture of anxiety because they realize that God's protection is not seasonal, it's structural. It's built into the identity of His people. They begin to understand that the safest place in the world is not a location, it's alignment. When you are aligned with God, you are protected even in environments designed to harm you. And this protection also creates boldness. When you know you're covered, you stop shrinking, you stop hesitating, you stop second-guessing every move, you stop living defensively, you begin stepping into rooms with purpose, speaking with clarity, making decisions with courage, and carrying yourself like someone who knows heaven is backing their assignment. Protection doesn't just shield you from harm, it empowers you to live boldly. So if you've been walking through a season where danger feels close, uncertainty feels heavy, or life feels unpredictable, don't assume God has abandoned you. Look again. Look deeper. Look spiritually. You may discover that the very thing you're surviving is the evidence that God is surrounding. And here's the reflection I want to leave in your spirit. You are protected not because life is calm, but because God is covering you. Walk like someone heaven refuses to let fall. When a believer begins to walk with the awareness of divine protection, something powerful is born in the human spirit, something that cannot be manufactured by personality, education, confidence, or positive thinking. It is a boldness that does not come from who you are, but from who walks with you. And this boldness is not loud, aggressive, or arrogant. It is quiet, steady, and unshakable. It is the kind of boldness that comes from knowing your steps are ordered, your purpose is guarded, and your life is anchored in something greater than fear. Fear is one of the most subtle weapons the enemy uses against God's people. It doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. It whispers questions like, what if it doesn't work? What if you fail? What if you're rejected? What if you're not enough? And those whispers, when repeated long enough, can paralyze a person who is otherwise gifted, called, and capable. But when God begins to heighten your spiritual sensitivity and surround you with His protection, those whispers lose their power. You begin to recognize fear for what it really is, a psychological prison built on imaginary walls. Most people think courage is the absence of fear. But true courage is the decision not to bow to it. And that's the kind of boldness God begins to cultivate in believers after seasons of separation, exposure, and protection. You start walking differently, not recklessly, but purposefully. You stop letting fear dictate your decisions. You stop letting anxiety drain your creativity. You stop letting insecurity shrink your potential. You stop living according to what could go wrong and start living according to what God said would go right. Boldness, in a spiritual sense, is not impulsive. It's informed. It's backed by revelation. It's strengthened by past deliverances. It's rooted in the understanding that if God protected you through everything you've already survived, He's not going to abandon you now. That realization becomes fuel. And suddenly, the things that once intimidated you no longer hold the same power. The conversations you avoided, you now engage with wisdom. The opportunities you delayed, you now pursue with clarity. The risks that terrified you, you now evaluate with faith rather than fear. This kind of boldness also shifts how you show up in the world. You stop hiding your voice. You stop apologizing for your calling. You stop dimming your light to make others comfortable. You stop seeking permission to be who God designed you to be. And this isn't about ego, it's about responsibility. When you understand that your life is part of God's assignment on earth, you realize you don't have the luxury of living timidly. Other people's breakthroughs may depend on your courage. Other people's healing may be connected to your obedience. Other people's direction may be tied to your willingness to step out. Boldness also affects your spiritual posture. You become someone who prays with authority instead of desperation. You speak Scripture as truth, not as theory. You confront temptation with conviction rather than compromise. And you stand firm in your moral and spiritual identity even when it costs you something, because boldness is expensive, but fear is far more costly. And here's something many believers never realize. Your boldness becomes a form of protection all by itself. When you walk with the certainty that God is with you, darkness recognizes it. Opposition feels it. Fear senses it. You become harder to intimidate, harder to manipulate, and harder to derail. Boldness builds a shield around your purpose because it refuses to negotiate with anything that opposes it. So if you feel God stirring courage inside you, if you feel something pushing you to speak louder, stand firmer, dream bigger, or move forward, don't suppress it. Don't rationalize it away. That is not just personal motivation. That is spiritual ignition. That is God setting fire to the parts of you that have been asleep for too long. And here's the truth I want you to carry forward. Boldness is the evidence that fear no longer owns your future. Walk like someone who finally knows that. When boldness settles into the heart of a believer, something extraordinary begins to unfold. You stop living life as a series of reactions and start living as a person with assignment. And this transition is not loud or dramatic. It usually begins with a quiet internal shift. You realize that life is not just happening to you, God is working through you. That is when Christians begin to step into their kingdom assignment, not as a religious duty, but as a calling shaped by everything God has been doing within them. Most people spend years trying to find their purpose, as if it's a hidden treasure buried somewhere outside themselves. But God rarely reveals calling through external signs alone. Calling emerges from the internal construction He's been building quietly, the clarity born from separation, the sensitivity developed through prayer, the purification of motives, the protection surrounding your journey, and the boldness awakened in your spirit. Purpose is not discovered suddenly. It is revealed gradually as you become the kind of person who can carry it. Your kingdom assignment is not just a career, not just a ministry role, and not just a personal dream. It's the intersection of your God-given design and heaven's intention for your life. It's the reason your personality is shaped the way it is. It's why certain injustices bother you deeply, why certain ideas energize you, why certain environments drain or inspire you. It's the quiet place in your soul where your passion and God's purpose finally recognize each other. And often, the assignment reveals itself in unexpected ways. You begin noticing that people come to you for wisdom in areas where you once struggled. You have compassion for situations that once irritated you. You find yourself speaking with authority in places where you once felt insecure. You start feeling responsible for things you used to overlook: your family, your community, your spiritual growth, your relationships, your future. That growing sense of responsibility is not pressure, it's calling. You may not hear God say, "This is your assignment." Instead, you sense it. It feels like a nudge, a pull, a restlessness that refuses to let you settle for an ordinary life when God has marked you for something meaningful. That's how destiny signals its arrival. It whispers before it commands. It stirs before it directs. This assignment also comes with weight. Not the weight of stress, but the weight of significance. You realize that your obedience matters, that your choices influence more than just your own life, that your faith is not merely personal, it is generational. Your healing becomes someone else's hope. Your courage becomes someone else's inspiration. Your transformation becomes someone else's roadmap. That's why God takes so much time preparing your character, because assignment without maturity becomes ambition, and ambition without wisdom becomes destruction. Walking in your assignment does not mean perfection. It means alignment. It means waking up every day asking God, how can I represent you where I am? How can I show your love, your truth, your light in the environment you placed me in? For some, the assignment will be in leadership. For others, creativity. For others, healing, teaching, serving, organizing, building, mentoring, interceding, encouraging. The role doesn't determine the value, obedience does. And the beautiful thing about divine assignment is that it never asks you to be someone else. It asks you to be the truest version of yourself, the version God designed before fear distorted, trauma twisted, or the world reshaped you. Your assignment calls you back to yourself, the God-authored self. So when God begins revealing the direction of your life, don't shrink back. Don't question whether you're qualified. Calling is not about qualification, it's about transformation. Everything God removed, everything He exposed, everything He protected, everything He awakened inside you was part of preparing you for this moment. And here's the closing truth I want you to carry in your spirit.